5 syllables. Milledgeville. For more than a century, parents in Georgia had a threat that worked better than any punishment. If you did not behave, that is where you were going. If you were different, difficult, or just unlucky enough to make someone uncomfortable, that is where you ended up. Milledgeville was not a diagnosis, it was a destination. And once you arrived, the odds of leaving were worse than you think. Everyone in Georgia knew the name. Almost nobody knew what was actually inside. By the 1950s, the place those parents were threatening their children with had become the largest mental institution on the planet. 12,000 patients, looked after by not even 50 doctors, not one of them a psychiatrist. A nurse allowed to perform surgery, doctors showing up to shifts drunk. It started with one doctor who believed the mentally ill should be treated like family. That is not what happened in Milledgeville. In 1837, the Georgia state legislature voted to build its first asylum. The law called it a facility for the state's lunatics, idiots, and epileptics. The site they chose was a stretch of land on the outskirts of Milledgeville, a cotton town in central Georgia that also happened to be the state capital. The buildings were constructed by enslaved laborers and convicts from the nearby state penitentiary. Even the first patient attendants were enslaved workers. The people who built it had no freedom. Neither would many of the people sent to live inside it. In December of 1842, the Georgia State Lunatic Asylum opened its doors. The first patient to arrive was a 30-year-old farmer who had been chained to an ox cart for the journey. He was dead within 6 months from what doctors recorded as maniacal exhaustion. But the man who shaped the asylum's early years was not that patient. It was the doctor who received him. Dr. Thomas Green became superintendent in 1845, and he brought with him an idea that was radical for its time. He called it the institution as family. When new patients arrived, often beaten, unwashed, and locked in iron restraints, Green made it a personal ritual to remove those restraints himself. He never delegated it. At every meal, he sat at the table alongside patients and staff. He abolished every form of physical punishment on the grounds. Under Green, the asylum was not a place to hide people. It was, by the standards of the era, something closer to a home. For more than 30 years, the model held. The asylum was small enough for Green to know every patient by name. Recovery rates improved. Patients who responded to care were sent home. The grounds were landscaped with fountains and flower gardens. The wards were clean and orderly. The state of Georgia believed it had built something worth being proud of. During the Civil War, Sherman's troops camped on the asylum grounds during their march from Atlanta to the sea. Somehow, the buildings were spared from burning. The hospital survived the war intact, but the war took its toll in other ways. Staff left to fight. Funding was redirected to the army. Wounded soldiers arrived needing care the asylum was never designed to provide. And what came afterward would prove far harder to survive than any of it. Because Georgia had realized something. An asylum is a very convenient place to send people you don't want to deal with. After the war, families began arriving with members who weren't mentally ill at all. They were elderly, alcoholic, inconvenient. Husbands had wives committed. Communities shipped off anyone they considered strange or difficult or simply different. The official admission records from this era read like a catalogue of everything 19th century Georgia refused to understand. People were committed for intemperance, for religious excitement, for laziness, for domestic unhappiness, for being kicked in the head by a horse, for leaving their husband, for ill treatment by their husband. In one of the more revealing patterns, a woman could be committed both for leaving a man and for staying with one who beat her. Some admission entries simply read unclassified. Nobody could even explain why the person was there. Green never turned anyone away. By the time he left in 1879, the population had grown to over 900. His successor, Dr. Theophilus Powell, inherited an asylum that was already straining. By 1910, 12 doctors were responsible for more than 3,000 patients. Reports of abuse, neglect, and unsanitary conditions were becoming routine. The institution Green had built as a family had become a warehouse, and for one group of patients, it was about to become something much worse. Dr. Powell made many contributions to psychiatric diagnosis during his nearly 3 decades in charge, but he also made a decision that would define the asylum for the next 70 years. He segregated black patients into a separate building, separate wards, separate resources, and not remotely unequal. Black patients, especially black women, consistently received fewer supplies, less medical attention, and worse living conditions than white patients across the board. In 1897, the building housing black patients caught fire. 1 person died. Dozens more contracted tuberculosis in the crowded, chaotic aftermath. When similar fires struck asylums in the north, communities took patients into local homes and churches until new housing could be arranged. In Milledgeville, the response was different. Dr. Powell moved black patients into underground tunnels beneath the hospital grounds. They stayed there until the building was rebuilt. That was not a temporary lapse, it was a signal. For the next half-century, black patients at Milledgeville would endure conditions that went far beyond overcrowding or underfunding. In the 1940s, Ebony magazine published an investigation of the asylum. The comparison it drew was blunt. The magazine described the white patient's experience as comparable to a prison. The experience of black patients, it said, was comparable to a Nazi concentration camp. If this is the first time you're hearing about what happened at Milledgeville, you're far from alone. If any part of this story resonates with you, or if your own family has a connection to a place like this, drop a comment below. And yet, somehow, daily life at Central State took on a rhythm that could almost pass for normal. By the middle of the 20th century, the asylum had grown into a self-contained city. It had its own post office, its own police and fire departments, churches, a dentist's office, and a beauty shop. The auditorium hosted live music acts and professional wrestling matches. Patients operated a massive farming operation that fed the entire institution. A single day's grocery needs in 1951 included 1,800 loaves of bread, 3,000 pounds of steak, and 4,000 chickens. All of it grown, raised, and prepared on the grounds. A patient's choir even performed Handel's Messiah. From a distance, it looked like a functioning small town. In some ways, it was. Central State was the largest employer in Baldwin County. For the people of Milledgeville, population roughly 11,000, the asylum wasn't just a neighbor. It was the economy, and that created a problem nobody wanted to confront. Every empty bed was a lost job. Every discharged patient meant less state funding. The town that had built its livelihood around the asylum had every incentive to keep it full and to look the other way about what was happening inside. It was inside this environment that Georgia took a step the rest of the country had already taken, and somehow made it worse. In 1937, Georgia became the 32nd and final state to pass a eugenics law. The law gave doctors the authority to forcibly sterilize any patient they considered unfit to have children. A state board of eugenics was created to approve the procedures, and the man appointed to chair that board was the superintendent of the Milledgeville Asylum himself. Think about that for a moment. The same man running the hospital was the one requesting that his own patients be sterilized, and he was the one sitting on the board that approved those requests. Dr. Thomas Peacock held that dual role from 1948 to 1959. In 1951, he published a medical journal article defending what he called the prophylactic value of forced sterilizations. He argued the practice protected patients from psychotic episodes and shielded children from mental trauma. In theory, patients could appeal the decision. In practice, researchers later determined that almost none of them understood their legal rights or even what was being done to them. Here is the part that is hardest to reconcile. By the late 1940s, the world knew exactly where eugenics led. The horrors of Nazi Germany's sterilization and extermination programs were documented, publicized, and condemned. Georgia's response was not to slow down, it was to accelerate. Sterilizations at Milledgeville climbed to roughly 200 per year through the late 1950s. By the time the practice finally stopped in 1963, Georgia had forcibly sterilized more than 3,000 people, the fifth highest total in the country. Another 44 years would pass before the Georgia legislature issued even a non-binding expression of regret. Sterilization was far from the only tool the hospital used to manage its population. Electroshock therapy arrived in the 1940s. One former nurse who worked at Central State recalled administering 75 to 80 shock treatments in a single session. Patients frequently could not tell whether the electricity was meant as treatment or punishment. Memory loss was common, unpredictable, and sometimes permanent. One patient described it this way: "Shock treatment makes you forget what you want to remember, and remember what you want to forget. And when electricity was not enough, there was surgery." Lobotomies were introduced in 1951. 125 patients underwent the procedure. 24 were able to return home. An unknown number were left worse than before. All of this was happening under the noses of politicians who could have intervened but chose not to. Governor Eugene Talmadge fired superintendents whenever it suited him. State legislators pressured hospital administrators into hiring political allies for jobs that a shrinking patient population would have eliminated. One superintendent joked upon his resignation that he was the only one who had not been kicked out or carried out feet first in a casket. By 1959, Central State Hospital housed more patients than any mental institution on earth, and it was collapsing. A reporter from the Atlanta Constitution named Jack Nelson drove southeast from the city to find out how badly. What Nelson uncovered was worse than anyone had imagined. Beyond the drunk doctors and the unqualified staff, Nelson found that a full quarter of the medical workforce was either in recovery from or actively struggling with substance abuse. Several of them had been hired immediately after completing their own treatment as patients at the very same hospital. Experimental drugs were being administered to patients without the knowledge or consent of their families. Unqualified workers were performing X-rays and administering anesthesia. Nelson published piece after piece, over 60 front-page stories in a single year. The series shook the state. At one point, a doctor from the hospital recognized Nelson in a Milledgeville restaurant and punched him in the jaw. What the doctor didn't know was that Nelson had been a Golden Gloves boxer. Nelson stood up, walked to a phone, and called in the story instead of throwing a punch back. The fallout was immediate. Staff were fired. The sterilization rate collapsed. The state was forced to increase funding for the first time in years, and in 1960, Jack Nelson was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting. Nelson's investigation forced Georgia to face what it had allowed to grow in Milledgeville. New psychiatric drugs were making it possible for patients to live outside institutional walls. In 1965, the hospital desegregated its wards. Patients had been separated by race for more than a century. In 1967, the asylum was renamed Central State Hospital, and Georgia established a system of regional facilities to distribute the patient population. By 1968, the count dropped below 10,000 for the first time in 20 years. Governors Carl Sanders and Jimmy Carter pushed the effort further, years ahead of the national deinstitutionalization movement. Patients were transferred to regional hospitals, community clinics, and group homes. But emptying an asylum is not the same thing as solving the problem that filled it. Many former patients ended up on the streets. Others fell into addiction. The buildings emptied. The illness didn't. As the living left Central State, the dead stayed behind. 5 cemeteries are scattered across the hospital grounds. They are segregated, just like the wards once were. White males in one section, white females in another. Colored males and colored females in their own separate plots. The dead were not buried under headstones. They were not buried under names. Each grave was marked with a small iron stake stamped with a number. A number. That was all that identified them, and eventually even that was taken away. In the late 1960s, prison inmates assigned to maintain the hospital grounds decided the iron markers were getting in the way of their mowing, so they pulled them out of the earth, at least 10,000 of them, and they threw them into the woods. For decades afterward, the dead at Central State had nothing. No stones, no markers, no indication that anyone was buried there at all. 25,000 people erased from the landscape of a place that had already erased them from everything else. In 1997, that changed. The Georgia Consumer Council, a group that included former patients of the hospital, launched a grassroots campaign to restore the cemeteries. They raised money through small donations and volunteer labor. They recovered 2,000 of the iron markers that had been discarded and arranged them on display at Cedar Lane Cemetery, the largest of the 5 burial grounds. Then they placed a life-size bronze angel on the grounds to serve as a permanent guardian over the dead. Beneath that angel, they buried a time capsule. Inside it was a single compact disc. On the disc were recorded the names of the people interred on those grounds. 25,000 names. Returned, after all those years, to the people who had been stripped of everything but a number, and then stripped of that too. That act of restoration sparked something larger. Psychiatric hospitals across the country began their own cemetery recovery projects, following the model that Milledgeville had created. In 2005, Cedar Lane Cemetery was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Georgia had been one of the first states to build an asylum. Now, it was leading the way in honoring the people those asylums left behind. Today, most of Central State's 200 buildings sit empty. The Powell Building, where Dr. Green once removed chains from patients with his own hands, still stands. The Jones Building, where nurses and doctors administered the treatments that defined the asylum's darkest years, is collapsing from the top down. Birds fly in and out of broken windows. A small forensic unit still operates on a fraction of the grounds. The rest is quiet. The story of Central State Hospital is not a story with an ending. The asylums closed, but they were not replaced with anything better. Jails and prisons hold more people with mental illness today than hospitals ever did. The question the asylum asked in 1842 is the same question we still have not answered. What do we owe the people among us whose minds work differently than our own? Milledgeville tried to answer that question for 170 years. It failed. But 25,000 iron markers, a bronze angel, and a buried disc of names say that the failure was not the last word. Someone remembered. Someone came back. If this story made you think of someone in your own life, or if it changed the way you see the history of mental health in this country, share that in the comments. These are the histories that disappear if nobody talks about them.